Today's panel on privacy imaginations from Indian science fiction will explore how Indian science fiction reimagines privacy as liberty, autonomy, and social justice. It's against the backdrop of biometrics mediating access to welfare, predictive policing, and intrusive models of platform governance, where we may ask how do we bridge the gap between the constitutional promise of privacy made 8 years ago and the techno surveillance futures that are already taking shape around us. Each of our speakers will bring their creative visions that are suitable to be put into practice or even to pose further inquiry. We're truly gifted to have Gautam with us. Gautam is a lawyer who's also been part of the Puttaswamy judgment and also is an author of science fiction. This provides him a unique vantage point, which I hope will draw a broader conversation today, in which he'll be joined by a stellar panel. Our first panelist will be Sanam Khanna, who's a faculty member in the Department of English at Kamala Nehru College at University of Delhi. She has written on Indian science fiction, including a chapter titled Spectral Cities and Spectral Selves in Shockwave and Other Cyber Stories, which is within Science Fiction in India, published by Bloomsbury in 2022. Then we have Swati Daftuar, who's an India-based editor and literary curator. She's currently a consulting editor at Speaking Tiger Books, and in her previous roles with HarperCollins and Hindu, she has commissioned across genres, including science fiction and speculative fiction. She's also published speculative short fiction under the title A Million Shades of White. And finally, we have Ritvik Bhattacharjee, who's an assistant professor in the Department of English at Sri Guru Tegh Bahadur Khalsa College, University of Delhi. He's a co-author of Science Fiction in India, Parallel Worlds and Post-Colonial Paradigms, and has had his stories and graphic work published in the Sahitya Academy Journal on Science Fiction. Please join me in welcoming all four of them, and over to you, Gautam.
So this panel is about Indian science fiction, privacy, and their intersection. And I'll just begin with a couple of preliminary remarks, and then we'll have a set of questions for the panelists, and after that we'll open it up for a few rounds of questions. Now, from its inception, science fiction has always been a genre that has been really curious about technology. There is a debate about what or which the first modern science fiction novel is, and while different books have adherents, there is broadly an agreement that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein marks the birth of the modern science fiction novel, and that, of course, is a book about technology and the promises and perils of technology. In the mid-20th century, science fiction developed an obsession with state power in the era of the rise of authoritarian states. The classic trilogy of 1984, Fahrenheit 451, and Brave New World are all books that envision a society in which state power has become so pervasive that private sphere of the individual has been reduced to almost nullity. They do it in different ways. But that is why, as a genre, with its focus on technology and the future, science fiction has always been well positioned to ask these questions about privacy, the future of privacy, and what technology is doing to us. The second element of this panel, Indian science fiction, I think is also important because often over the last few years, when I reference Indian science fiction to people, I get bewildered looks or just this question of what is Indian science fiction, this idea that, well, first of all, only white people write science fiction. Indians write really heavy post-colonial novels about family trauma, and also that it's basically a Western import. That is not true, actually, because as early as the 1890s, Jagdish Chandra Bose writes a story where a bottle of hair oil stops a typhoon. That is early Indian science fiction. Rohia Shekhawat Hussain, the Bengali writer, writes a story in a world in which patriarchy has been inverted. Right? So Indians have been writing science fiction for a very, very long time. And so this panel brings together those two aspects, science fiction and privacy and Indian writing of science fiction. So with those remarks, I'll begin just asking the panel some questions. The first one is broadly flows from the opening remarks, which is that science fiction's always explored technology and its implications both from an optimistic lens, utopian science fiction, but also a deeply pessimistic lens, dystopian science fiction, and of course the whole range in the middle. Modern day issues of privacy, as Justice Patel told us in the last session, implicate questions of technology at a very deep level. So how do you see both global and Indian science fiction responding to this intersection of privacy and technology? And I'll just begin with, just most proximate to me. So Sanam, you could start off and yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. And as Gautam said, I'm often asked, is there Indian sci-fi? So I have a minuscule drop in the ocean from my personal library over here, which I consider excellent introductions if you're not familiar with Indian sci-fi. Right from writing for children to, of course, writing from adults, from the late 19th century right up to now, Indian sci-fi, I think, explores very important issues, and presciently it does so before other forms do. So, Justice Patel's address ended on that note of utopia and dystopia. And that, as you know, is the staple of science fiction. Science fiction always explores what is utopia and for whom. And right from the beginning, from Thomas More's Utopia to the works that we are discussing here today, this has been one of the central features. What makes something utopian? What makes something dystopian? And that's where this issue of privacy, which I do think, I'll come to that as the second part of my answer here, which seems to be a Western import. That may be so, but dignity is not. Dignity is very central to the Indian concept of conceptualizing what it means to be human, to have a quality of life worth living. And these have always been explored in Indian sci-fi, from his own novel, The Wall, Manjula Padmanabhan's Harvest. If people haven't read that, I heartily recommend it, about organ transplant, Tarun Sen's 2 volumes on science fiction in Southeast Asia give you an excellent overview of the kind of anxieties and hopes that Southeast Asian fiction and Indian SF specifically puts forth. Now, coming to the question of privacy. Privacy in one sense, like I said, in Indian conceptualization, and I mean largely, beyond the legal, into the personal, into the cultural, is not one of our top priorities as a culture. We've lived in joint families. We have always had, this is a sad part of our history, disempowered groups. So one of the questions that SF asks, through centralizing these marginal groups, women, Dalits, for those who haven't read Mimi Mondal, a very good introduction to how what she calls Dalit futurisms, re-envisaging re-envisaging the past or the future through alternate visions. What this does is place that question of dignity and privacy side by side. We also have our colonial past to deal with. We have that my baap attitude. The Sarkar has the right to kind of invade your space, invade your body, look at the kind of proscriptions for certain people, certain classes of society over space. So on one hand, yes, I think privacy as a concept is a privileged concept. Only the privileged can afford to think of privacy. But what SF does is shows you what happens if you don't think about privacy from the top to the bottom of society. So that's where I'll move, leave it to move forward, because the gamut of privacy questions and dignity questions which Indian SF addresses, I think it does so in a very different way from Western SF and in a far more culturally rooted way than foreign SF.
Yeah, and I think that just to add to that, Anil Menon's book, Half of What I Say, which was published in 2016, actually is very interesting because it takes Aadhaar as a concept and takes it to its logical extreme. And there you see, this idea of privacy in a future India and how it intersects, economic boundaries. Swati.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. This subject of kind of talking about privacy and science fiction, it made me really think about the question that you asked, which is global science fiction and Indian science fiction. And are we seeing anything different between the two? And if there is difference, then what is that? And I feel like one of the things, just because my job involves reading a lot of manuscripts, so I end up seeing a lot of things that you might not actually end up making it to the shelves, but you do see patterns emerge. And one of the things is that in Indian science fiction, I think, and I'd say that maybe for me at least, the genre of science fiction is probably the best genre to lay out our anxieties and lay them out, like you said, to its logical conclusion, the worst or the best of what we are already seeing on ground. And this is something I've seen in Indian science fiction a lot, which is that how it might be slightly different from global science fiction in a local and contextual way is that a lot of times what I see in Indian science fiction is not too distant future, in the sense that what we find in Indian science fiction today is actually recognizable. It's familiar. You might be seeing a Delhi or a Kolkata. Usually these are the cities you'll see in Indian science fiction. You'll see Bombay, Delhi, Kolkata, and you'll see them in a way and in the way they look and feel and sound in that piece of literature won't be too far away from what we're experiencing today. What you'll actually be seeing is an extreme form of what you probably are already experiencing. So there's that, I think, that really stands out for me. And what it also does is shows me what the authors, writers, thinkers today are grappling with, the things that they're grappling with. And the other thing that I do want to point out is that one of the concerns of Indian science fiction, of course, there's technology, but like you said, I think you rightly said that privacy for Indians has always been a complicated thing. It's stratified. It's also not just privacy from the government, from the state, but I think, like the keynote address also talked about, it's from so many people. In India, it's not about being in a locked room. It's about being in a really crowded room with so many eyes on you. So when that's the point, then who is asking for this privacy? Whom are they asking for this privacy from? All of these things come to the fore when you read Indian science fiction. And what happens then is the science fiction that you're reading from India is also stratified, in the sense that when you're reading it sitting in, say, an urban society, maybe what you're reading will feel like dystopia. But actually in India, pockets of the country are already living the dystopia that we might be thinking of as dystopian. So I feel like all of these things come together in Indian science fiction, which I would say I don't think it's so cut and dry that the global science fiction does not have that. But there is a certain somehow a lot of global science fiction, and I think this will come up, sometimes it imagines things which are maybe too far into the future. You might know of certain ideas, but they won't feel as close as they do to you when you're reading in science fiction. And a book there, like, for example, Samit Basu's books. I remember reading Turbulence as one of his early science fiction, and it was so familiar. It was just... Actually, it was a gateway science fiction book, I felt, because it was a superhero science fiction book. A bunch of people take a flight and they land as superheroes. It was an interesting sort of concept, and now with the city inside, I think he revisits, and Delhi's very familiar there. Prayag Akbar's Leela, it's a familiar concept. So I feel like that maybe is what stands out to me when it comes to Indian science fiction.
Yeah, I think Leela is interesting because, like you said, a lot of Indian science fiction takes the social cleavages that exist today and really shows you their extreme version. Yeah. And Leela is perhaps the one that shows you the most terrifying, of that. And of course, it was made into a series as well, where I think surveillance is so pervasive, right? Yeah. So, and surveillance is a very Indian form, which is already exemplifying or entrenching other kinds of social structures. And that's a good example, I think, of that near future Indian science fiction that where privacy and surveillance become, really, really sharp issues.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. I think it's a very complex question that Gautam has asked, and I have a three-part answer, as we academics usually do. The first part is on the idea of Indian science fiction itself, and prior to that, science fiction itself. Because once you start thinking about it and just wonder what really is science fiction, where you see that science itself is something which works on the unknowns. And then you have the addendum of the fiction as well. So if you think about it, science fiction is basically the episteme of science on science itself. So in moments where science is failing, you find science fiction. Having said that, science is a very Western thing. I'm not saying that we do not have science or we do not understand within the Indian context science itself. But if you want to think about it, science is Western because it is a methodology. What we have, so this is something that I call in my book proto-science, where, different ways of doing the same thing. What we have been doing in science, the experiment, I think most of us have done that, right? In one side ruled and one side empty pages, writing experiment, observation, and inference. That's a very Western way of doing science. In which case, if you want to think about science fiction, you have to also think about the fact that we have a very different way of doing science. That, for the lack of a better word, think of something like Ayurveda. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, that's not my purview, but I'm saying it nevertheless is a way of finding some kinds of answers which do not or which are not commensurate with the way that West does science. In which case, our science fiction is different as well. So the trajectory follows and the logic follows. So the kind of narratives that you get to see, especially, I love Vandana Singh's story. It's called Yakshantriksh. It's not in any, it's available online, and it's the one that Vandana, I and a friend, we just converted into a graphic format, because why not? It is a story where the emptiness of the universe or the unknowns of the universe are merged with the idea of the Yaksha, because suddenly that makes more sense. And the things which are not explained by, science, is suddenly explained by this humongous snake on whose body we find ourselves, and so on and so forth. So if you want to think about Indian science fiction, we find a kind of a collation where the ways of finding answers, because that is ultimately what science is, and we go to Levi-Strauss and things like that, way of finding answers is a little close to our own selves, close to the way we do things, close to the facts, or close to the kind of lives that we do live. And you can call them, mirchi lagao to bhoot bhagta hai. That is the thing. And we believe that. And Marquez says that that is our reality, right? In terms of his own. The second part is of technology, where, we have been always speaking about technology as if it is something so distant from us. But it is not. We are, in a sense, bound to technology, where technology, yes, is evolving from one thing to another, but we are nevertheless bound to technology. We are all cyborgs. This story, Rahul, I can't pronounce this other name. It's yes.
Sankatayan, yeah.
His story. Imagine someone from the 20th century has come, the 1920s has come now, and they're seeing that you're talking on your headset and you're just touching, and then, you are a cyborg for them, aren't you? So technology is something which is so intrinsic to our lives that it has absolutely removed the differences between where the physicality of our body is and how do you extend forward from it. How many of you have 2 Instagram pages? And in having those 2 Instagram pages, do you not present yourself differently in both these Instagram pages? It's you, right? Then how do you have 2 different presences and physicalities within that digital space? But it's you nevertheless. So I think technology has to be thought of as something which is entangled with us. And I'm moving towards the quantum entanglement. And I think Vandana Singh, when I was interviewing her, she was saying that hum bol to dete hain, but samajhte nahi hai. But it's true, right? I think Justice Patel said, how many of you can actually live without your smartphones? And how many of you can actually have that peace and quiet which you hope for without the smartphone? but it'll not be peace and quiet. It'll be just absolute chaos and shore in your head and things like that. So when we are also writing and thinking and reading technological interventions, or we find a kind of an impulse which pushes us towards finding ourselves within these technological universes, it is not something which is distanced away or broken away from ourselves. It is a reduplication, as it were, of ourselves in perhaps manners which have not been thought of, yes, in manners which have not necessarily been produced because we don't have those kind of, well, technological interventions or innovations and so on and so forth. So the narratives that we do get to see, either globally or in terms of, well, the Indian context or the South Asian context, we also find that we are consuming science differently. We are doing that kind of our epistemology is different, that we are thinking differently, we are finding answers differently, and our interactions and workings with technology is different. So I think Samit Vasu came up, so Chosen Spirits is a very good example, right? Yeah. There is a reason why all of these case serials are so famous here. And how, as we move forward in time, that they have also evolved and become a part of our lives to a lot of extent. Anyway, the others for later. The third part, sorry for taking so much time, is about privacy itself. And I want to pick up one thing, Who Watches the Watchmen, which I'm taking from the Watchmen graphic novel. It's interesting because surveillance is something that we detest, but as Justice Patel said, it's a sword and a shield situation, right? So yes, I did use it. Because we seem to detest surveillance, yet we cannot really live without it. So Who Watches the Watchmen is fine. So, I mean, surveillance is fine as long as there's some other surveillance on that surveillance. And it's a very strange kind of, again, a serpentine situation, if you would have it. So when narratives are also talking about it, yes, they are questioning, is it necessary or not? Thinking about welfare, thinking about that entire Kantian thing about morality and the need for the civilization to come first or not. But we are also essentially thinking about ourselves. Where do we actually find ourselves in terms of surveillance? Something, at times it hurts, at other times it doesn't. And yes, it boils down to choice, but I will leave with a very simple question. Do we really have choices? Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just, in fact, the second of these questions speaks to a bit of that. Before I go there, I'm glad you brought up Rahul Sankratyayan, because I think most people in this room will know him as this brilliant travel writer who wrote these amazing travelogues from Volga to the Ganga, and a socialist thinker, all of that. But what most people don't know is that he was also a science fiction writer, and he's written this story called 22वीं Sadi, which imagines life in the 22nd century. And he wrote this book in the 1920s. So imagining 200 years in the future. So yeah, if you get access to that, I would recommend reading that book by him as well.
It's in Tarun's book.
You have the...
Would you like to read the extract?
It's in Tarun's book.
It's quite amazing.
Right.
That, over 150 years ago, this is how he's imagining a utopian future. So
Well, this paragraph is actually interesting. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay, sure. Yeah. Each home has a separate toilet.
Unimaginable at that time.
Yeah.
Unimaginable that there is a toilet in the house. Even if you had a toilet, it would be outside. So when he's writing, this is his utopia.
After one is done, one turns the tap and a powerful jet of water washes away the waste. I learned later that there are no manual scavengers now. There is no such caste. Yes, when the tap malfunctions, any person who is deputed for the task will repair it. The village's waste travels about 4 miles, where large pits have been prepared. As waste falls into the pit, machines cover it with soil. The machines are electrically run and the operators are at a distance. Each pit is left covered with soil for 4 years, after which chemical substances are added to it. It is then used as manure for trees. And one interesting thing about this story is that it's a utopian story. So he imagines technology to have solved social conflict, which I think is the interesting segue into the second question, which also takes, I think, riffs off what Justice Patel said, which is that in India, the question of privacy is really inextricably bound up with questions of class, caste, and of course gender hierarchies. So I remember during COVID, there was this study that showed that one fallout of the lockdown was that women's phones were surveilled a lot more, because now they couldn't go out, and so the ability to surveil them increased, which had all kinds of ill effects on them. So you can't separate the question of privacy from the major fault lines of Indian society, which are caste, class, gender, and so on. So how do you see Indian science fiction dealing with the very specific ways in which privacy and surveillance intersect with these hierarchies in our society? And I'll do the very unimaginative moderator thing of now reversing the order and asking Ritvik to start. Yeah.
I wasn't ready for that. There are a lot of science fiction stories. Again, Vandana Singh comes to my mind, and I don't remember her story, where the protagonist has absolutely no gender. And it's not just the protagonist. Most people, again, I seriously don't remember the name, they do not have genders at all. And nobody seems to care. Right? It's not as if that the point of the story is that people do not have genders or do not have gendered identifiers, but more than that, that it doesn't actually come up. The simplest, I remember this entire thing, sorry, digressions. I remember this entire debate which came out after the release of the first Deadpool film. If, I don't know how many have seen it. There is a lesbian couple there. And it is never actually mentioned. Because it is so natural that why do you need to mention it? Why do you need to put these kinds of adjectives and identifiers in front of... So, I mean, it's the same thing like saying a woman police officer. Right? Why put that adjective there? Because that adjective is, once again, narrowing down, identifying, and surveillance begins with identification. Right? The first step is to say that, all right, you are X, Y, Z, and now we're going to do things. So the entire thing about data collection is finding these identifiers and then working through them through the entire process that happens. But yes, I mean, as I said, because the kind of play, and I'm using a very Derridian term, without going into the intricacies of unnecessary philosophy, the kind of play that we do get with science fiction, the kind of, I mean, just imagine it's bacche khel rahe hain. The kind of play that we get with science fiction allows us the possibility of living a life where nobody has a gender and nobody cares. And it's not just genders, I mean, even disabilities. Because I do work with disabilities a lot. Disabilities are always right now considered as separations, where one specifically thinks that to be disabled means to need extra things. But nobody thinks that we have created a world where they are forced to have those extra things. So instead, just imagine a world which is, well, for the lack of a better word, inclusive. And they will not need those extra things. I mean, if you're making a presentation, why do you want to restrict yourself to a PowerPoint which is pictures? Just do the next thing and read out what is in the pictures, and so on and so forth. So because of the kind of play that we do get with science fiction stories, which fundamentally come because of their what do you call that, the fantastical nature in a sense, and the kind of stretches of imagination that they can have beyond the constrictions of reality, gender, caste, they don't seem to matter anymore. And the realization of all of these within the narrative space, and I say realization with the word real/ization, to make those things into real, actually work. They come out, they pop out and say that, all right, this is there. Now, I don't want to comment if this is something utopian or dystopian, or if it is something that you can look forward to or not, but just the fact that as a genre, as something which is out there as a narrative form, it does give it. And the moment you do get it, something clicks in your head. There are cogs running. Do what you want to do with those cogs running. That's a separate issue. But I think there are ways into, and then once again, I go back to technology, that because we are bound to, I mean, we are all post-humans in a sense, that because we are bound to these technological movements, because we are bound to technologies, some other things tend to take a step back, good or bad. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of modern science fiction in the world building makes it a world where these markers are no longer salient. But of course, it's still science fiction written in our world. So there is this whole debate about the extent to which you can have a genuinely, non-heteronormative world building in science fiction, and to what extent you must take into account that it's still, that those will still be salient. So I think.
Yeah. So I think I'll answer the question that we were looking at was how, in terms of when it comes to Indian science fiction, how does it grapple with? Sorry, can you? Yeah. Is it okay? Oh, excellent. So how do we grapple with the social realities, right? Caste, class, gender. One of the things that came to my mind when I was thinking about this point and thinking about surveillance, for example, and I think I already said one of the things in Indian society is the stratification of it, right? Like in the sense of every group will have a different group watching it, and it starts right from home. For example, I mean, women are watched constantly by their families. Every movement is tracked. Where you go, your parents want to know either for your safety or for other reasons, you need to kind of give your whereabouts. If you really think about it, every time you order a delivery, we are constantly tracking gig workers today. We are tracking them on our phone. We want to know exactly where they have reached, what their numbers are. I remember during COVID, we had to also know whether they are vaccinated or not vaccinated. All of those things are tracked constantly. And I think for me, the interesting thing about Indian science fiction is that once again, it doesn't directly import the Western concept of the big brother individual rights and freedom. So you don't constantly think about privacy in terms of individual rights, but also community rights, minority rights. In terms of, so for example, Manjula Padmanabhan's, I think we've already mentioned one book, but another book that came to my mind was Escape. The idea of gender and how in that actually the rights of women are completely and altogether wiped out. So you've got books which are not looking just at what individual freedoms mean in the country today, but they're looking at freedoms for communities, for Dalit students, for example, for manual laborers, for example. Again, privacy, we talk about dignity, there's a certain idea of, and I think that inviolable space that we talked about, all of that comes into play when Indian science fiction has to be written, because who do you write about? What do you write? So you talk about tech and how tech is getting into our lives, right? How on your smartphones, everything's monitored. But then how do you talk about dystopia when it comes to people who don't even have access to internet, smartphones, ordering something, putting your data online? There's so many stratas of surveillance in India and so many ways in which you can approach science fiction in India that one person's dystopia is another person's reality. And I feel like that is a very interesting space. And the most interesting science fiction for me when it comes from India is when it surprises me in looking at spaces that I had not thought about, because what I was looking at as a violation of my private life was probably happening with someone on a day-to-day basis. And if that can be pointed out, and if I can feel the lived experience of that science fiction or that story or that imagination, I think that's very interesting to me. I also do think today we are looking at science fiction changing a little, in the sense that I do think, and this is something that I don't know, I mean, this is a question that I was talking about when I was discussing the points that you had sent, and I would like to also know an answer. I know you are the one doing the questioning to us, but I want to know what happens with dystopias. I want to know what happens. We have been reading dystopias. You've read Utopian, a section that imagines something good, and it's great that we are at that point where that seems like, oh, of course this happened. But we've also read so many books which warned us of so many things, right from, I don't know, from the 1800s, we have been hearing constantly about, if you do this, this will go wrong. This is how bad it can get. We have been shown the extremes of what our actions can bring us. And have we listened? What does science fiction do when it presents utopia? And I know that we'll get into dystopias later, but I do want to know because every time you read about dystopia, it essentially makes it a little more real to you, and it makes it a little more possible. So what happens when we imagine those kind of futures? And the thing with Indian science fiction is it's doing it all the time now. I don't know if I have read utopias in science fiction for a while. I've only read dystopias in a very, and I say it as an editor also who constantly receives submissions. I can't imagine the last time, I don't remember the last time I read about a utopia that could imagine a better world. So what does that say about Indian mindsets and writing and what we have been imagining for ourselves? Is it only dystopias now?
I mean, it's interesting because around 2.5 years ago, starting off the science fiction reading circle in Delhi, which is, which we still do, and in just a sort of expression of interest format, I'd asked, what kind of science fiction would you like to read? And this was, of course, anonymous, so people were answering it anonymously. And by far, the largest number of responses were, we want to read dystopia. So I think it's not just writers, but
readers
clearly
also.
readers want to experience that,
You think it's
perhaps.
confirmation bias?
Well, I mean, I don't know, because I mean, I personally,
No, for them, for readers.
Yeah,
We know this will happen. We now
Yeah.
wanted to see it in print.
It could be. I think it could also be the Greek idea of catharsis, right? The tragedies.
yes.
I'm not sure, but people are just obsessed with dystopias. But we'll come to that in a moment. Yeah.
Okay, I won't repeat what others have said. Let me take this to a slightly different direction. First, one caveat. I personally don't like the term science fiction because of the very Western epistemological reaction to science and Enlightenment philosophy that's ingrained within that word. I far prefer the term speculative fiction, which opens out the field, takes within it fantasy, horror, different kinds of imaginations. And within that, Indian science fiction, and I would now use the term speculative fiction, is kalpanik, imaginative, which then, your tilasmi kahaniya from the Arabic and the Urdu tradition, the sensational stories that were printed in magazines in the early 20th century, all get subsumed into this idea of the speculative. Now the question is, what are we speculating on? I'm sorry, but to answer your question, utopia is long dead. But I'll go back to the original utopia, Thomas More. It's utopian, but many people forget that there's an entire slave population which has freed the elite to do only art and thinking. So that one man's utopia, even there is another person's dystopia. I think that is a certain feature, a fabric of our speculative fiction to which our authors have always been alive. Even if they are writing from the elite, like Sanskritayan here, he's imagining a toilet in every home. We've got there. Have we got to a point where we've eliminated manual scavenging? Not yet. So his envisaging of utopia is still left undone. So I think that's the undone project of utopia, because every dystopia, and I see dystopia differently, I don't see it as pessimistic. I see every dystopia as expressing a fear in the hope that the future will not repeat this mistake. So, whether it's Leila, whether it is The Wall, whether it's Manjula Padmanabhan's Harvest or Escape, they're all saying this can happen if we don't do this. Now, to bring the question back to privacy, I come back to that. We have always had a very hierarchical understanding of privacy. Who has privacy? Who doesn't have privacy? What Indian speculative fiction does is highlight that. It brings it home. Like you said, something that you see as an invasion of your privacy, especially during COVID, when you suddenly find that your park has been locked up, you're not allowed to walk. Or if you remember in the early time, the early cases of COVID, they would actually put barriers around them and a policeman would be stationed there. Yeah. After that, they had civil defense personnel who would be stationed. Yeah. That marking out of the diseased body, is that an invasion of privacy or is it a protection of public health? How do we negotiate that space between the public and the private, the violation versus the preservation? These are questions that have always been at the forefront, but like I said, the word privacy is less important than the idea of dignity. And I'm coming back, even within Western SF, I have seen, that's my opinion, that post 9/11, there is a shift. And, if you've read Manjula Padmanabhan's little address on the zine that's been circulated, she uses the word sovereignty. Now, sovereignty for me is a very interesting concept, especially within legal jurisprudence. And I'm going back to Joel Feinberg, who in the 1980s asks the question, what happens if I commit suicide? Why is that a punishable crime by the state? Now, I think that is a question that really repositions the idea of who owns what, which is a central question in all Indian speculative fiction. Do I own my body? Do I own the space around my body? Or is it at all times governable by someone else? And it's very interesting that we don't have an equivalent term for sovereignty in most of the Indian languages. You have swatantrata, you have astitva, individuality, but you don't have the idea of sovereignty, which combines the personal and the political. And why I say after 9/11, this is a very pivotal moment, because 9/11, and if you remember Bush's speech after that, the war on terror is a war against an unspoken enemy, unnamed enemy, to preserve the sovereignty of the country. And if in that preservation of the sovereignty of the country, habeas corpus, which is again one of the fundamental tenets of Western law, produce the body, prove the crime, can be waived even if the accused is an American citizen. Now, I think this is a pivotal moment philosophically in terms of how we look at ourselves and our place as citizens, because what this does is places the sovereignty of the state in conflict with the sovereignty of the citizen within the Western paradigm. Does that similar paradigm exist within Indian SF? And here now, when I say SF, I mean speculative fiction. I think within Indian speculative fiction, the tension has always been between individual and society, that society may be governmental, it may not be governmental. It can be social, it can be the community, it can be patriarchal, it can be gendered, caste-based. But that tension has always been a fundamental area of exploration within Indian writing, speculative or especially post-colonial, post-20th century, other forms of writing as well.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm glad you said speculative and kalpanic, because the Bengali word for science fiction is literally kalpvigyan on all the years. So there's always been that more expansive vision that later was picked up as speculative fiction. I think just for the final round, before we open it up for Q&A, since we've all spoken about dystopia, and dystopia is something that really people associate with this kind of writing. And of course, as Swati said, a lot of recent Indian SF, although not all of it, but a lot of it really is very, very dystopian, or at least has elements of dystopia. There was an article by Cory Doctorow a couple of years ago, I think, or a year or so ago in the New Yorker, perhaps, where he was responding to, I think, a lot of the modern day climate fiction, which of course has a very dystopian tenor to it. And he makes this point where he says that what these kinds of dystopian novels really do is that they induce a kind of political quietism, in the sense that they portray these structures that are unshakable, immovable. Again, 1984 being the example, right? Like, in the end, what happens? Winston Smith, basically, it's complete destruction of his individuality, right? And so he actually says that there is a certain political harm to writing these kinds of dystopias, where you're inducing, a sense that these are unchangeable structures. And like we said earlier, in India already, life for some is dystopia for others. William Gibson has that famous line that the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed, right? So in that sense, many are already living in that dystopia. So in that sense, how do you see, this focus of a lot of contemporary Indian SF to be dystopian, in light of something like what Dr. Rose said, that there is a certain kind of political choice you're making in that case? And of course, that doesn't mean you write utopian fiction. Dr. himself is not a utopian writer. And you have, of course, Ursula Le Guin's famous phrase, ambiguous utopia. So there are other kinds of writing. But I was just wondering, what do all of you think about this sort of stress on dystopia in these times and what it says as a choice that Indian writers are making. Begin with Swati and then, yeah.
We all get a chance to
Yeah,
start
exactly.
first.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've said a little about this already. So what I would like to first talk about is actually utopia. So essentially, what I mean when I talk about the need for utopia is not utopia the way we've read about it, which is a perfect world for everyone. That's not. I'm thinking more along the lines of, and I was thinking about what I want or what I would like as a reader, not just as an editor or a writer. I would like to see it as a reader also, which is utopias of resistance or repair or refusal. Essentially, what happens, and this is where what you said about that quietism, the political quietism. What I'm thinking of is there's a certain resignation built into dystopias. Sometimes there's a certain, like you said, this is too big to change. It will never change, and what you see is an individual struggle against it till the point that the struggle is no longer possible. And what that does is, I think, constantly reading things which reinforce this idea or this image. Not just resignation, but there's also a sort of predictiveness, which essentially moves from cautionary, which is basically like a warning, to in an eventuality. You continue like this, and this is where you'll reach, is what that thing is telling you, that piece of text, that piece of imagination is telling you. Whereas there is a sense that there could be resistance, which is actually ultimately successful. And I'm talking about imaginations here, which is, if you look at utopia the way we would like to see utopia now, of course, it would be impossible. And like you very rightly said, utopia is dead in that way. No one's utopia. I agree that I don't think you can have a blanket utopia for anyone. But what you can have is a depiction or a rehearsal of resistance against the state, resistance against surveillance, resistance against a lack of privacy. And I do struggle to see that right now. And I think that kind of shows, I don't know, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say the mood of a nation, but it is a slight leaning of a people, which is, we are in this thing, we cannot, and internet has come up so much, WhatsApp has come up so much, Instagram has come up. It is true. I don't know if any of us, especially the people sitting here, can do without some form of surveillance, because surveillance is also what's bringing you convenience and ease. So are we more and more inclined to stay the way we are, or to take it even further? Because convenience keeps going up. Is that what we are looking at? So then what we see in dystopias and fiction, etc., is it just a playing out of what we are now going to sooner or later live? Or do we see, sometimes is literature supposed to inspire and move to the point that it shows you what could be possible if there was, like I said, resistance and refusal and rejection of things? And it is difficult to say if dystopia is harmful, but I do sort of agree to the point that read too many times, it could deaden something, in the sense of a no, that no that comes as a collective no. It can sometimes have that effect. I know that the more I read dystopias, the less I'm worried or moved. I've read various versions of no women in the world before. I have read various versions of reproductive privacy and rights and sovereignty and everything vanishing. I've seen it played out on the screen. I've seen it played out on the screen. What happens if the state monitors every bit of your movement? But what I've not seen is what happens if collective community solidarity, resistance, etc., works. What happens then? Do we find a way to resist? I haven't seen that. So that is, I'm saying, as a reader, that's something I would love to see in Indian science fiction more. I know there are stories I've read that show me that, but I would like to see more of that. Yeah.
And then we'll close with.
Yes. Thank you. I don't know. And I'm coming from Samit Basu's Some interview, that perhaps the dystopias that we are so inclined towards, that the world is constantly coming up, are actually utopias. That these are the best possible scenarios that you're ultimately going to get. And so the resistance that Swati is talking about, it's not actually in presence, but in the absence. That so Chosen People has these, it's a smog filled Delhi, and there's, I think at that time when he was writing, it's 2019, there's riots going on, and in the book it has just gone up in scale, and then corporations are taking over your mind and they're basically feeding you reality TV shows. So what if that is the best case scenario? And if that is the best case scenario, what are we actually heading towards if we don't do something else? I don't know what that something else is. I'm not that intelligent. But the question, which is why I'm saying that this thing about the dystopic has always bugged me a little. It's not Indian science fiction per se. It's this novel called Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. I don't know. So it's a lovely story. It's about this oppressed people, and then from the low classes, here comes a heroine who suddenly finds that she has superpowers, and she overthrows this tyrant, and then realizes that she should not have done that. There's something worse behind that, and that's how the story progresses, and things happen, and so on and so forth. So, I think that somewhere deep inside, I don't know, we know that things are bad. And I'm not talking once again just about governmentality. I'm also talking about this very absurd thing called life that we find ourselves in. Sorry, philosophy again. But it is a problem, right? You keep on asking a question, why me? And nothing answers back. So Camus calls this is the Sisyphean thing where you keep on rolling the rock. Nevertheless, so whenever we are thinking about dystopias or utopias, those who walk amongst the Omelas comes immediately to mind. It's a story, utopia, and then there is this. Imagine you will always be happy except for one boy somewhere who will always be sad. Right? It is because of this boy's sadness that you're happy. Will you want to be happy? And it's a very good question, because do you look at yourself or do you look at another person? And the number of times I've asked my students this question, and the number of times they have said, I don't know, because I'm always inclined towards myself rather than the other person, because utopic imaginations hit our head because we find ourselves in those utopic imaginations. Those are not removed away from us. So, which is why I'm saying that this distinction between the dystopic and the utopic is not just, it's not just the fact about that someone's utopia is someone else's dystopia, but that you always see a kind of a crossover where dystopias are utopias and utopias are dystopias. And yes, science fiction has been responding to it in some ways. So I'm a part of this, and it's a funny thing that I'm a part of this science fiction group, will not name it, which is perhaps one of the most surveilled groups that I'm in. It's a WhatsApp group. And the moment someone posts something there which is not to the liking of the admin, it gets immediately, and not removed, but rebuked. The admin is going to come and say, "Kyun likha?" And this is a nationwide group, by the way, which I don't know why I still am a part of, but academic reasons. But it is, as I said, it's a funny thing. And because it is a funny thing, you get to see that however much you start speaking through science fiction of privacy, of surveillance, I remember of the early classes, Hamlet also comes to my mind because of surveillance, right? Hamlet will know what he has to do only if he surveils, but he doesn't like surveillance himself. So when Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are hiding behind yes, he kills them mistakenly, but he doesn't want to be surveilled himself, but he wants to do surveillance. So play is the thing that will catch the conscience of the king. हम देखेंगे, but हम दिखना नहीं चाहते हैं, in that sense. So how do you think about this complex position where within a singular system of literary representation, perhaps, you get the dystopic and the utopic working and functioning at the same time? So perhaps not as not as bifurcated entities, but as things happening together. Right?
Yeah, and I think it's good you brought up Le Guin's, the ones who occur from Amelas, as in the dystopian stream, because this is a story which is 4 pages long, and it's been so influential for the last 50 years. people have been trying to change the ending and write their own stories because they just can't deal with how brutal that story is, and every subsequent attempt is much worse than the original. So read the original. It's just 4 pages and it's like a classic. Sanam closes off. Yeah.
Yeah, so, just to go back to that question of privacy, utopia, dystopia, I'll say that, the resistance lies in the interstices, the things that fall through. And one of the features I find very interesting in SF being written in India recently is satire, laughter. Laughter becomes the ultimate resistance. If you can laugh at the power that is surveilling you, if you can make them discomforted by that laughter, that becomes resistance. That sets off ripples of other resistance. And I'm going to read a line from the Ministry of Relevance by Arjun Gend, which I think is so. Do you laugh? Do you cry? As our glorious leader has enumerated in his majestic treatise, The Reinvention of India, traditionally the poorest segments, the downtrodden and the backward classes are mistreated because they are dark-skinned. That is why he is committed to helping them become paler to ameliorate such dermal inequalities. What do you make of a state which is trying to bring in equality, but through something like this? I'm going to read another line which I love, which is from someone who's of Tibetan descent writing in India. And she's writing about her own experience, but we can all see resonances there. That's what we get for burying our heads in religion and forgetting the world. The world went ahead, we went back in time. So much for our rituals, prostrations, and amulets. I'll end there. Those are your resistances. Those are where you push back and create solidarities. Thank you.
Firstly, I'd just like to thank all of you for staying very close to 9 p.m. You're going to be kicked out of this hall in 8 minutes, but I'm just going to keep this 2 minutes short. This panel was excellent, and IFF is going to make a reading list because I think every second answer had a recommendation, right? Yeah. And in case you're wondering where will you get all these books, one of the cases which IFF does is for researchers who are wanting access to Sci-Hub and LibGen. Okay, and that is listed tomorrow. And if you like the work which we do, which is not only Privacy Supreme, but also our strategic litigation, such as cases in the High Court, the Supreme Court, or our policy advocacy or outreach, please do support us. Please do donate to us. We do need your help. Because when you ask, where is civil society? Where are organizations like IFF? If you're watching this and you've stuck till the end, you found this of some value. So please do donate to us. It is internetfreedom.in/donate. And as I do on Privacy Supreme every year, I will state how much money this costed, because then it makes it real to you. I'm persisting with this. Hold on for a second. ISC costs itself were about 68,000 rupees. And printing and designing costs were 31,000 rupees. Inflation is real. And you can keep us alive. So please, if you want that reading list, more importantly, if you want to read those books itself, please donate to us rather than paying to a fat cat publisher. Thank you so much.